So I was in Mysore. Actually, it was my second trip in India, and I had been traveling from south to north, both trips, and then going by bus and train from city to city, and mainly visiting temples. And in every city that I went to, wherever I saw someone was teaching yoga, I would go in and take a class from them. And met mainly really bizarre people. And so I was doing the same thing again my second trip, and I was coming through Mysore. It was my second time in Mysore, and I was on my way to the BR Hills, where there was a Swami named Nirmalananda used to live. And I was planning on going there for a few weeks just to do my practice and be in nature. And I was attending a week of lectures at the Jagan Mohan Palace by a Swami named Swami Dayananda. And he was speaking on the Bhagavad Gita and on Vedanta. And then every day he was giving classes in his hotel room, which was at the Dasa Prakash Paradise, and which was really a bizarre juxtaposition for me. He was a big Swami staying in a super fancy hotel. Made me a little nervous. The last day of the lectures, I was early to get to the lectures, and I popped into the communist bookstore, which was at that time next door to the Jagan Mohan Palace. It's no longer there. Not a lot of communists still in Mysore. They all moved to Kerala and Bengal. And I was in the bookstore. The man said to me, "Why are you in India?" I said, "I came to try to learn some yoga." And he said, "There's a great yoga teacher here in Mysore. You should go meet him. His name is Pattabhi Jois." I said, "I've never heard of him. I'd love to meet him." He said, "He lives next to the police station in Lakshmipuram. Go meet him." I said, "Okay." So the next day, took a rickshaw to Guruji's house, found the police station, walked down the block, saw a tiny sign on the door that said Ashtanga Yoga Nilaya, and knocked on the door. And Guruji answered. And that was it. Then I met him.
You have to forgive me, I'm a little emotional already just sitting here and talking about Guruji. So I discovered Ashtanga Yoga via my first teacher, Graham Northfield, in Australia, in a very small country town called Lismore. I had previously gone to India, and in a similar vein to Eddie, went knocking on doors looking for yoga, and came across, again, an equal number of strange and interesting people who gave the impression that if you didn't know who they were, then you shouldn't be there, so I shouldn't be there. I went home and found Ashtanga Yoga in a small country town. And then later that year I had a car accident in which I drove the car into across a causeway. And for those of you who know about Australia, it's a wild country, particularly when it comes to rain. And so I drove across the causeway in the way to town, and then when I came back from town, I drove across the same one, and it picked up the car and dragged it into the river. And I managed to get out, but it took them 5 days to find the car. And something inside of me changed, and I started to become more and more insecure and more introverted. And I realized that unless I did something courageous to really shift that patterning, I was never going to reach my potential. So I thought of the scariest thing I could, and that was to go to Mysore and spend some time with Pattabhi Jois. I got the same directions as Eddie, go to the police station. And I think Pattabhi Jois answered the door with a mar, and it was like, "Hi, come in for coffee." So incredibly welcoming. And from that moment on, they treated myself, and I think just about everybody who passed through that door as family. So really quite a special introduction. Well, we'll go back to the year 1973.
been to India one time already and had been studying in Pondicherry with Swami Vivekananda. So we went to meet his guru, and while we were there, things started happening, made us realize we wanted to go somewhere else. So David was really my guide. I knew nothing about yoga. And he had 3 ideas of people and places to go. And he said, if we don't find a yogi there that we want to study with, then I'm done. I don't think there is one in India. His 3 choices. First, he had heard of Pattabhi Jois. That was number 1. We were going to go there and see if we liked him. If we didn't like him, we were going to head to Pune and meet B.K.S. Iyengar. His 3rd choice worried me a little bit because it was a man who buried himself alive. So I was kind of hoping he liked one of the other 2. So we headed off to Mysore. And when we got to Mysore, we checked into this little hotel in the train station, walked to see where this Pattabhi was, knocked on the door, same as they had done. Saraswati opened, and first thing she said is, how did you find us? And we told her that we knew of him because of Norman Allen, who was an associate of David's his first time in India. And Norman had gone to Mysore, and they'd been there already 4 years when we showed up. So we kind of were curious what kept Norman there. So she told us to sit and wait. Guruji was in the market. So we were sitting there, of course, having the normal coffee that the Joises always seem to put in our hands. And in walked Pattabhi Jois. He had a scooter in those days, so he had just gotten off his scooter, and he walked in, looked at us, how did you find it? And we said, Norman Allen. And he said, come in. And we started practicing in the morning with him.
I know the answer to this one. And it has to do with Nancy and David, and I must have met Nancy and David shortly after that. It was around 1973 in Encinitas. And then they brought Pattabhi Jois for his first trip to the U.S. in 1975. And we were all fired up. There were, I don't know how many of us, but it seemed like quite a lot of just broke, enthusiastic hippies doing this yoga. And Dave goes, we're going to bring the guru.
We're going to bring the guru. Oh, that.
We didn't really know what to expect. We just go there, and he arrives with his son Manju. And this is the first memory I have of Pattabhi Jois. He steps off the plane, and the first words I remember him saying is he was pointing to his son. He says, this is my son, Swamiji. And Manju turns and looks at us and says, I'm no Swami. My name is Manju. We have come to break your back.
My story's not as interesting as other people's stories, but the chronology works from Nancy to David to me. Those guys are much older. So back in 1978, I actually had a job working at a psychiatric hospital. And I had never taken a yoga class, but I'd read a couple of yoga books. So based on my vast knowledge of yoga, I started teaching a yoga class. Luckily, they weren't the most discerning students. They thought that I was great.
You were the only one.
They thought I was a brilliant teacher. I was feeling a little bit guilty about the fact that I was teaching a yoga class and had never actually taken a yoga class. So I started seeking out a yoga class, and somehow, magically, the yoga school appeared like half a block from my house in Encinitas. down on the corner of Loveda and Marchetta Avenue. Some of you know Encinitas. So what was originally St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. So we called it the Old Church, and so I walked in, took a class, and blew my mind, and so I started practicing there regularly, and practiced for about 6 months, and then my teacher, Brad, said, by the way, this Indian guy is going to come and teach here for a few months. Do you want to take classes? And I didn't have any money at the time, so I didn't think I would be able to because it was going to be really expensive. And I said, well, how much is it going to cost? And he said, well, like $75 for 3 months. And that seemed like an awful lot of money. But somehow I came up with the $75. And at the time I was reading this series of books called The Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. Some of you read these books, maybe. It talks about all these incredible beings that had all these psychic powers, all these cities, all these powers of bilocation and stuff. And so I figured the day that Guruji showed up, he was just gonna materialize in a ball of light in the center of the room. But actually the door opened and this little Indian guy came in. He was wearing black loafers and black horn-rimmed glasses, you know, like a white dress shirt and a white lungi. He seemed quite ordinary, actually, but he wasn't. At the time, he was 63, just about my age. But he was the most energetic 63-year-old that you would ever want to meet. He was quite strong and quite ferocious in his adjustments. We all lived in fear of being adjusted. Probably the only thing worse than being adjusted was being ignored. It's kind of a catch-22. Also, at Brad's request, Guruji was teaching a theory class 3 times a week, and Guruji didn't really speak English at the time, so theory classes were happening at Manju's house, and so Manju was acting as the translator. So Guruji would give these long discourses in Kannada, and we'd break into lengthy quotes of scripture, the Gita or the Upanishads, and Guruji would go on sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes, and he would laugh, he would cry, he would become very animated in this discussion, and then he would turn to Manju for the translation, and we would get like 6 words. So we were losing a little in the translation. Anyway,